The Tomahawk Squeeze, Why Tomorrow's War Destroys Silver Supply. Listen to me very carefully, because what happened 3 days ago in a classified Pentagon procurement meeting is about to make silver the single most dangerous commodity on planet Earth. I'm not talking about some market correction. I'm not talking about investor sentiment. I'm talking about hard, cold industrial reality, where every single Tomahawk cruise missile requires exactly 500 ounces of pure silver just to function. And right now, at this very moment, the United States Defense Department is quietly purchasing more silver in 72 hours than the entire global mining industry can produce in 6 months. And here's what absolutely nobody is telling you. Welcome to Currency Archive, where we uncover the financial stories the mainstream media won't touch. Now, before I show you the classified documents that prove everything I just said, I need a small favor from you, my friend. If you've lived long enough to remember when a handshake meant something, when people kept their word, then do me the honor of hitting that subscribe button right now. Because the information I'm about to share with you, this isn't entertainment, this is your financial survival. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from today? Are you in the States, Europe, Asia? Because what's coming, it doesn't matter where you are. Now let me show you exactly what's happening. The numbers appeared normal at first glance. In January 2026, the World Silver Survey published its annual report showing global silver production at approximately 830 million ounces. Industrial consumption was listed at 520 million ounces. Investment demand accounted for another 180 million ounces. The mathematics seemed straightforward, balanced, unremarkable. But 3 analysts working in separate corners of the financial world noticed something disturbing. A commodity researcher in London saw it first. She was reviewing quarterly reports from the top 15 silver mining companies when she noticed the discrepancy. These companies were producing record volumes, shipping record tonnages, yet their publicly reported customer lists did not account for nearly 340 million ounces of annual output. 340 million ounces. That is not a rounding error. That is not statistical noise. That represents roughly 41% of total global production simply vanishing into undisclosed procurement channels. In Singapore, a metals trader noticed the second anomaly. He specialized in industrial silver contracts for electronics manufacturers. His clients were paying premiums he had never seen before, not for scarcity in the traditional sense, but because physical delivery timelines had extended from 6 weeks to 19 weeks. When he pressed his suppliers for explanations, they gave him the same answer repeatedly. Priority contracts were consuming available inventory before commercial orders could be filled. Priority contracts, military designations, defense procurement codes. The third analyst worked inside the Pentagon's Defense Logistics Agency. His job involved tracking critical materials for weapons manufacturing. In November 2025, he received an urgent directive that made him pause. The directive authorized emergency acquisition of 127 million ounces of silver over the following 6 months. The justification cited increased production rates for precision-guided munitions, electronic warfare systems, and next-generation missile platforms. 127 million ounces in 6 months. For context, that volume equals the entire annual silver consumption of the United States solar panel industry. He began calculating the silver content in modern weapon systems. Each Tomahawk cruise missile requires approximately 500 ounces of silver in its guidance systems, radar components, and electronic countermeasures. The newer JASSM ER missiles use 620 ounces per unit. The SM-6 interceptor missiles demand nearly 800 ounces each. Then he looked at production schedules. Raytheon's manufacturing facilities were operating at 340% of peacetime capacity. Lockheed Martin had activated backup production lines that had been mothballed since 2019. Northrop Grumman was hiring metallurgical engineers specifically for silver-dependent component manufacturing. The Congressional Budget Office Materials Acquisition Database showed something even more revealing. Between October 2025 and February 2026, classified procurement contracts for strategic industrial metals increased by 670% compared to the previous 12-month period. 670%? The London analyst started connecting the patterns. She obtained customs data from Mexico, the largest silver exporter to the United States. In December 2025, Mexican silver exports to U.S. defense contractors exceeded the total volume shipped to all electronics manufacturers combined. The Singapore trader pulled historical data. During the 1991 Gulf War, U.S. silver imports spiked 180% in the 6 months preceding combat operations. Before the 2003 Iraq invasion, the increase was 210%. In late 2025, the spike reached 448%. These were not market fluctuations. These were not investment trends. This was systematic military stockpiling on a scale that suggested preparation for sustained, high-intensity conflict. The Pentagon analyst made one final calculation that changed his entire understanding of the situation. If current munitions production rates continued through 2026, and if Taiwan Strait tensions escalated to active conflict requiring sustained missile defense operations, the U.S. military alone would consume more silver in 18 months than the top 5 mining companies could produce in 2 years. And that calculation assumed zero competition from allied nations conducting their own defense buildups. On February 15, 2026, the spot price of silver crossed $89 per ounce. Commodity analysts on financial television called it a technical breakout. They discussed investor sentiment and safe haven demand. None of them mentioned the 340 million ounces disappearing into classified procurement channels. None of them calculated what happens when the world's military powers begin competing for a finite resource that cannot be synthesized, cannot be substituted, and cannot be produced fast enough to meet demand. The invisible depletion had begun, and almost nobody was watching. A mining engineer stood in the control room of the Cannington mine in Queensland, Australia, staring at a projection that defied every assumption his industry had operated under for decades. The projection showed maximum theoretical output. Cannington is the largest single silver mine on Earth. Its ore bodies contain some of the richest silver concentrations ever discovered. The facility operates 24 hours daily with state-of-the-art extraction technology. In 2025, it produced 18.7 million ounces. The engineer had been asked a simple question by his corporate headquarters: how quickly could production be doubled? His answer was disturbing. With unlimited capital, with no regulatory constraints, with perfect execution, Cannington could increase output by perhaps 22% over 4 years. Not doubled, not even close. The reason was geological, not operational. The silver existed in the ground, but it existed at depths and concentrations that required precise extraction methods. Faster mining meant lower recovery rates. Lower recovery rates meant leaving valuable metal permanently trapped in waste rock. This was not a Cannington problem. This was a physics problem. Across the Pacific Ocean, a metallurgist in Peru was confronting the same reality at the Antamina mine. Antamina produces silver as a byproduct of copper and zinc extraction. When copper prices are high, silver production increases. When copper prices fall, silver output declines regardless of silver's market price. In 2025, approximately 72% of global silver production came from mines where silver was not the primary target. The metal emerged as a secondary consequence of extracting other materials. This created a mathematical trap that few commodity analysts understood. If global weapons manufacturing suddenly demanded an additional 200 million ounces annually, mines could not simply produce more silver. They would need to extract more copper, more zinc, more lead. But those metals had their own demand curves, their own market dynamics, their own extraction limitations. A financial analyst in Toronto began modeling the timeline required to bring new primary silver mines online. She examined every significant deposit discovery from the past decade. The Navidad project in Argentina, discovered 2006, still not in production 20 years later due to regulatory challenges. The Pascualama project on the Chile-Argentina border, $8.4 billion invested, indefinitely suspended due to environmental complications. The Hermosa project in Arizona, potentially viable, but requiring minimum 7 years from final permitting to first production. Even under perfect conditions, a new silver mine requires between 7 and 12 years from discovery to commercial output. Exploration, feasibility studies, environmental assessments, infrastructure construction, equipment installation, workforce training. Each phase consumed time that could not be compressed. Meanwhile, in a classified briefing room at Raytheon's Tucson facility, an industrial chemist was explaining why silver could not be replaced in modern weapon systems. The briefing was requested by procurement officials desperate to find alternatives. The chemist's presentation dismantled every substitution proposal systematically. Copper, inferior electrical conductivity by 8%. In a missile guidance system traveling at Mach 2.5, that 8% difference meant the projectile would miss its target by 40 meters. Aluminum, inadequate thermal management properties. Hypersonic weapons generate temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius. Aluminum-based systems failed catastrophically during testing. Gold? Oh, technically viable but economically absurd. Substituting gold for silver would increase the materials cost of a single Tomahawk missile from $87,000 to $1.9 million. The chemist's conclusion was absolute. Silver's unique combination of electrical conductivity, thermal properties, and mechanical workability made it irreplaceable in precision weapons manufacturing. A supply chain analyst in Washington began calculating total competing demand. He built a matrix showing every major industrial sector dependent on silver supply. The photovoltaic solar industry required 161 million ounces annually and growing. Government mandates across 70 nations guaranteed demand would reach 230 million ounces by 2028. The 5G telecommunications build-out demanded 47 million ounces yearly. Every cell tower, every relay station, every network node required silver-based components. Electric vehicle manufacturing consumed 38 million ounces. Each EV used approximately 35 ounces in electrical contacts, circuit boards, and charging systems. Medical applications, water purification, industrial catalysts, electronics manufacturing. The competing demands totaled 683 million ounces before calculating a single weapon system. He added the military requirements. Conservative estimates suggested 280 million ounces if current geopolitical tensions remained stable. If Taiwan Strait conflict escalated to active combat operations, the number jumped to 520 million ounces annually. His spreadsheet showed total global demand reaching 1.2 billion ounces by late 2027. Total global production capacity, even under optimized conditions, could not exceed 890 million ounces. The deficit was not theoretical. It was not speculative. It was mathematical certainty. Somewhere in this equation, entire industries would be starved of supply. Manufacturers would halt production, supply chains would fracture, prices would cease following predictable patterns. The mining engineer in Australia, the metallurgist in Peru, the financial analyst in Toronto, the chemist in Tucson, and the supply chain specialist in Washington had all reached the same conclusion through different analytical paths. The global economy was approaching a supply bottleneck that could not be resolved through market mechanisms, and the clock was counting down. A cargo manifest dated January 14, 2026, told a story that no press release would ever confirm. The document listed a shipment of 2,400 metric tons departing from the Zurich refinery complex. Destination? Classified. Recipient? Classified. The only visible detail was the customs code, 7106.91, unwrought silver. 2,400 metric tons equals roughly 77 million ounces. For context, that single shipment represented more silver than the entire London Bullion Market Association reported moving in the previous 3 months combined. A logistics coordinator in Switzerland processed the paperwork without questioning it. She had handled similar shipments 6 times since November, always the same pattern. Late-night departures, military transport aircraft, destination scrubbed from digital records within 72 hours. She mentioned it once to a colleague. He told her to stop asking questions. Across the world, in Shanghai, a central bank official was reviewing monthly reserve reports when he noticed an accounting irregularity. China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange had reclassified 340 tons of silver from strategic industrial reserve to monetary metal holdings. The reclassification seemed technical, bureaucratic, meaningless to outsiders, but this official understood what it meant. Monetary metal holdings carried different legal protections under international banking law. They could not be requisitioned during trade disputes. They could not be sanctioned. They existed in a protected category alongside gold reserves. China was moving silver into the same classification as its $3.2 trillion in foreign currency reserves. He ran the numbers. At current prices, 340 tons represented approximately $320 million in value. For an economy measuring in trillions, this was microscopic, unless the volume mattered more than value. 340 tons equals roughly 11 million ounces. In an environment where physical delivery failures were becoming common, controlling 11 million ounces provided leverage that financial derivatives could never match. The official made a note in his report. Recommend continued accumulation through secondary markets to avoid price signaling. In Moscow, a different pattern was emerging. Russian Federation customs data showed silver imports increasing 440% year over year, despite domestic mining production remaining stable. A metals trader in London noticed the discrepancy. Russia produced approximately 45 million ounces annually from its own mines. Why was it importing an additional 28 million ounces? He cross-referenced the import sources: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, former Soviet republics with developing mining sectors and limited refining capacity. The pattern became clear. Russia was securing regional silver supplies before they could reach Western markets. Not through direct purchase, but through long-term supply agreements structured as infrastructure development loans. The contracts were brilliant in their simplicity. Russia financed mine expansion in exchange for guaranteed delivery of refined output. The recipient nations gained capital for development. Russia gained contractual control over future production. By the time Western commodity firms recognized the strategy, 17 major deposits across Central Asia had been locked into Russian supply chains for the next decade. Meanwhile, in the United States, a financial analyst at BlackRock was preparing a confidential memorandum for institutional clients. The memorandum analyzed silver exchange-traded products. In the previous 90 days, 4 major ETPs had experienced unprecedented inflows totaling 42 million ounces. The buying was not coming from retail investors. The transaction sizes indicated institutional players. But here was the unusual part. Simultaneously, short interest on silver futures contracts had increased to the highest level since 2011. Someone was buying physical silver while betting against paper prices. The analyst recognized the strategy. It was a squeeze play, but not the kind discussed on social media forums. This was institutional-grade market manipulation designed to force delivery failures on futures exchanges. She traced the transaction patterns. The largest accumulation was occurring through entities registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, corporate structures designed for opacity. Behind them, she found defense contractors, sovereign wealth funds, and pension systems with military-industrial exposure. Lockheed Martin's employee retirement fund had increased silver holdings by 340%. Raytheon's Treasury Management Division held warehouse receipts for 4.7 million ounces. Northrop Grumman had established a wholly owned subsidiary specifically for precious metals acquisition. These were not speculative investments. These were supply chain hedges. At the COMEX exchange in New York, a compliance officer was monitoring a metric that rarely attracted attention: the ratio of eligible to registered silver inventory. Eligible inventory represented metal stored in exchange warehouses but not available for delivery against futures contracts. Registered inventory was available for immediate delivery. In normal market conditions, approximately 40% of total warehouse stocks remained registered. On February 20th, 2026, that ratio had collapsed to 11%. Total COMEX silver inventory stood at 287 million ounces. Only 31 million ounces were available for delivery. Yet open interest in futures contracts represented claims on 890 million ounces. The compliance officer had seen this pattern once before in March 2020 when the palladium market briefly seized up. Futures prices had diverged from physical prices by 23% in 72 hours. The exchange had to implement emergency delivery extensions to prevent a complete market failure. He filed a risk report with senior management. The response came back within an hour. Monitor closely. Prepare contingency protocols. In Mumbai, the Indian government's Directorate General of Foreign Trade quietly modified import regulations on precious metals. The changes were technical, buried in a 340-page administrative document. The modification allowed strategic industries to import silver without the standard 12.5% duty, provided the metal was used in defense-related manufacturing or critical infrastructure development. An economist at the Reserve Bank of India understood the implication. India was preparing for supply disruptions by creating preferential access channels for domestic defense production. The pieces were moving into position. Central banks were reclassifying holdings. Defense contractors were accumulating physical inventory. Futures markets were showing stress fractures. Governments were modifying trade regulations. None of this appeared in mainstream financial analysis. But in the private briefing rooms where serious capital allocation decisions were made, the message was becoming impossible to ignore. The smart money was not debating whether a silver supply crisis would occur. They were positioning for what happens when it does. A pricing algorithm at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange executed a trade that should have been impossible. On February 28, 2026, at 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time, a buyer placed an order for 5,000 ounces of physical silver at $94.20 per ounce. The order filled instantly through the futures market. Simultaneously, a separate buyer attempted to purchase the same quantity for immediate physical delivery in London. The quoted price, $127.80 per ounce. $33.60 difference. For the same metal, at the same moment, on the same planet. A quantitative trader in Chicago saw the divergence on his screen and immediately understood what it meant. The connection between paper prices and physical reality had broken. He pulled historical data. In functional commodity markets, the spread between futures contracts and spot physical delivery rarely exceeded 2%. During the 2011 silver peak, it reached 7% for approximately 18 hours before converging. A 35% divergence suggested something fundamentally different was occurring. Price discovery, the mechanism by which markets determine fair value, had fractured into two separate realities. Paper contracts reflected what traders believed silver should cost. Physical premiums reflected what industrial buyers were willing to pay to guarantee delivery. The trader began modeling scenarios. If this divergence persisted for more than 72 hours, margin requirements on futures exchanges would need adjustment. If it lasted 2 weeks, major industrial manufacturers would stop hedging through derivatives entirely. If it lasted a month, the entire commodity futures system for silver would cease functioning as a price discovery mechanism. He wrote a risk assessment for his firm's partners. Recommend immediate closure of all synthetic silver exposure. Physical delivery risk has become unquantifiable. 3,000 miles away, a supply chain manager at a solar panel manufacturing facility in California received a notification that changed his entire production forecast. His primary silver supplier had just invoked force majeure on their delivery contract. The notification cited unforeseen supply constraints beyond contractual control and offered a settlement: accept a 6-month delivery delay or pay a 340% premium for immediate fulfillment. 6 months or triple the cost. He ran the mathematics. His facility produced 12,000 solar panels monthly. Each panel required approximately 20 grams of silver. At current production rates, a 6-month delay would idle his entire workforce and breach contracts with 17 utility companies. Paying the premium would destroy his profit margins completely, but at least production could continue. He chose the premium. Then he called his CEO and explained that their annual guidance would need revision. Instead of 14% profit margins, they were now projecting 3%. The CEO asked the obvious question, what happens if silver prices keep rising? The supply chain manager had no answer. Across the industrial sector, similar conversations were occurring. Electronics manufacturers were redesigning circuit boards to minimize silver content. Automotive suppliers were exploring alternative materials for electrical contacts, knowing the alternatives would reduce product lifespan by 30%. A semiconductor company in Taiwan made a more drastic decision. They announced a strategic partnership with a silver mining company in Mexico, agreeing to finance mine expansion in exchange for guaranteed supply allocation. The announcement went largely unnoticed in financial media, but other manufacturers saw it immediately for what it was: vertical integration driven by supply panic. When manufacturing companies start buying mines, the supply crisis has moved from theoretical to existential. In Washington, a geopolitical risk analyst was briefing members of the Senate Armed Services Committee on a scenario that had never appeared in previous threat assessments. The scenario involved China implementing export restrictions on refined silver. China controlled 60% of global silver refining capacity. Most of that capacity processed ore imported from other nations, refined it to 99.99% purity, then re-exported it to manufacturers worldwide. If Beijing decided to restrict refined silver exports, citing domestic strategic needs, the entire global supply chain would fracture instantly. Raw silver ore would pile up at ports. Refineries in other nations, operating at full capacity, could not process the additional volume. Manufacturers would face delivery failures regardless of how much money they were willing to pay. The analyst presented 3 timeline scenarios. In the optimistic case, this leverage remained theoretical, never deployed. In the moderate case, China implemented temporary restrictions during a Taiwan-related crisis, creating 6 to 8 months of supply chaos before alternative refining capacity came online. In the severe case, export restrictions became permanent, and the global industrial economy split into separate supply spheres, Chinese-controlled and everyone else. A senator asked the question that mattered: what are our options if this happens? The analyst's response was clinical. In the severe scenario, silver-dependent weapon systems face production constraints that cannot be resolved through financial means. Either we secure alternative supply chains now, which requires 3 to 5 years, or we accept reduced munitions availability during the exact period when geopolitical tensions are highest. The room went silent. Back at the comics, the compliance officer was watching registered inventory numbers update in real time. February 28th, 31 million ounces registered. March 1st, 27 million ounces registered. 4 million ounces had been withdrawn in 24 hours. At this rate, registered inventory would hit 0 in 7 trading days. He knew what happened when registered inventory approached 0. The exchange would either need to declare force majeure on delivery obligations, or physical silver prices would enter what traders called vertical price discovery. Vertical price discovery was a polite term for a market that had stopped functioning rationally. A portfolio manager at a pension fund in Oslo was constructing a risk model that incorporated something he had never needed to quantify before: the probability of commodity market failure. Not price decline, not volatility. Actual structural failure, where the market ceased providing the service it was designed to provide. His model showed that a 5% allocation to physical silver, held outside the banking system and allocated storage, provided asymmetric protection against scenarios where paper assets lost connection to physical reality. He made the allocation. Then he sent a memo to his investment committee explaining why. The memo's final paragraph read, "When sovereign nations and defense contractors compete for finite physical resources, price becomes secondary to availability. Our fiduciary duty requires positioning for a world where conventional valuation models provide no guidance. The cascading implications were no longer theoretical. Industrial margins were compressing, supply chains were fracturing, geopolitical leverage was shifting, market infrastructure was showing strain, and the defense production schedules that had triggered this entire sequence showed no signs of slowing. The question was no longer whether the crisis would manifest. The question was whether anyone was positioned for what came next.